fortune, I see.
This is one that nobody else has. That's something else.
Who would have imagined that the man who once stood tall with a squint that could silence a room now moves slowly through the halls of his secluded home, rarely seen by the public? At 95, Clint Eastwood, the iconic cowboy of Hollywood, lives a life so distant from the spotlight he once commanded, it feels almost unreal. There was a time when Clint Eastwood wasn't just a name, he was an era, the face of American masculinity, the ultimate lone wolf on screen. Millions idolized him. Billions recognized him. But behind the camera flashes and the timeless close-up shots, a quieter tragedy was unfolding. Now, at nearly a century old, the world is beginning to ask, where is Clint Eastwood? Why has he vanished from public life? And more importantly, what happened to him? Those closest to him whisper of a man who rarely speaks anymore, of rooms filled with his old movie posters, but also silence, of a body growing frail, but a heart still holding on to memories, to regrets, and perhaps to one last goodbye. This isn't just the story of a Hollywood legend fading into the twilight. This is the story of a man, once larger than life, now navigating the final act of his own. And after this video, you may never see Clint Eastwood the same way again. Before the fame, before the cowboy hat, before the camera ever rolled, there was just a boy. A boy named Clint Eastwood Jr., born during the harsh winter of the 31st of May, 1930, in San Francisco, California. His arrival into the world coincided with one of the most difficult periods in American history, the Great Depression. His family was constantly on the move. His father, Clinton Sr., a steelworker, bounced from job to job across the West Coast, dragging the family behind in search of stability that never came. By the time Clint was a teenager, he had lived in more than 10 different towns, never truly settling, never truly belonging. In school, Clint was a quiet boy, tall, lanky, with a permanent look of worry etched across his face. Teachers thought he was too withdrawn. But how could a child be carefree when home meant uncertainty and tomorrow was always a question mark? His childhood home wasn't filled with music or laughter. It was filled with the echo of arguments behind closed doors, the rustle of packed suitcases, the silence of empty dinner tables. His mother, Ruth, did what she could to keep the family together, but even love couldn't shield Clint from the emotional toll of a life constantly uprooted. He once said, "When you're young and life keeps shifting under your feet, you learn not to trust the ground." And that mistrust grew into a quiet anger, an inner fire. Clint didn't cry, he didn't scream, he simply observed. He watched people. He memorized pain. He built invisible walls around himself and hid behind silence. Not because he didn't feel, but because he felt too much. Then came the moment that shaped him forever, a plane crash. During his teenage years, while working odd jobs to support himself, Clint enlisted in the Army and found himself on a military transport plane that crashed into the Pacific Ocean. He had to swim several miles through shark-infested waters just to survive. That near-death experience didn't just scar him, it made him realize something chilling. Life doesn't wait for anyone, he would later reflect. You either fight or you disappear. From that point on, Clint Eastwood was no longer just a quiet boy with a turbulent past. He was a survivor. But survival, as he would soon learn, came with a price. He would carry the scars of those early years, the instability, the emotional detachment, the silence, well into adulthood. And some of those wounds, no matter how successful he became, would never fully heal. Because even as Hollywood embraced him later as a symbol of strength, it would never see the frightened child still hiding beneath the surface. In the aftermath of near-death, Clint Eastwood returned to civilian life with a hardened resolve. He had no formal acting training, no connections in the film industry, and no money to spare. But he had something far more dangerous, a quiet obsession with survival, not just of the body, but of identity. His early jobs were a reflection of someone who didn't yet know who he was, but was willing to do anything to avoid sinking. Lumberjack, gas station attendant, hay baler. But there was one constant: people noticed him. Not for his smile, not for his words, but for his silence. That unshakable stillness, that distant stare. And then came a twist of fate. In 1954, a man spotted him on the Universal Studios lot. Clint wasn't there to act. He was just another wandering soul. But the man saw something, perhaps the angular jawline, perhaps the quiet menace in his presence, and offered him a contract. Just like that, he was in the system. But the system didn't welcome him. He was told his Adam's apple was too big, his voice too soft, his acting too wooden. "You'll never make it in Hollywood," one agent bluntly said. Clint failed his first screen test. Then he failed the second. And the third. The rejections piled up like unanswered letters. Studios cast him in bit parts, most of which were never credited. He was background noise in films where no one even looked at his face. Even among extras, he was invisible. Still, he didn't walk away. He failed his first audition, then the second, then the third. But he kept walking toward the fire. What others saw as emptiness, Clint turned into energy. He devoured books on acting. He sat silently in film sets he wasn't even a part of, watching directors work, memorizing how light hit an actor's cheekbone, how silence could stretch tension. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was learning how to conquer. Then came the first glimmer, a television series called Rawhide. It was 1959. Clint was cast as Rowdy Yates, a young cattle driver. It wasn't a lead role. It wasn't even a particularly complex character. But Clint brought something unexpected to it: stillness. Audiences were mesmerized. Here was a character who didn't need to talk to control a scene. He didn't smile. He didn't shout. He simply existed, and that was enough to steal attention. But behind the scenes, Clint was still fighting. Executives wanted him to play more likable, more animated. He refused. He knew instinctively that what made him unique wasn't charm, it was restraint. He was beginning to understand his power. And then came the invitation that changed everything. A little-known Italian director named Sergio Leone was casting for a new kind of Western, one that defied the clean-cut American heroes. Leone wanted grit, silence, and danger. He found all three in Clint Eastwood. The role was the man with no name. And with it, Clint Eastwood became a legend. But even in his first moment of true recognition, he felt no joy, just relief. Asterisk, "I didn't feel like I made it," he later said. "I just felt like I had a place to hide for a while." The boy who had spent his youth moving from town to town had finally found a face the world wouldn't forget. But fame, as he would learn, is a mirage. And the deeper he entered the machine of Hollywood, the more he realized the fight was far from over. By the early 1970s, Clint Eastwood wasn't just a star, he was a force. The spaghetti westerns had made him an international icon. A fistful of dollars for a few dollars more, and the good, the bad, and the ugly turned a silent, brooding cowboy into a timeless cinematic archetype. Men copied his walk, studios chased his shadow. Audiences whispered his name like it belonged to legend. But Clint wasn't content being a puppet in someone else's vision. He had spent too many years observing from the shadows to remain just an actor. So he stepped behind the camera, and something extraordinary happened. In 1971, he directed Play Misty for Me. It was raw, suspenseful, and deeply psychological. Hollywood scoffed at the idea that a former TV cowboy could direct. Clint didn't care. He just did it, and it worked. That was the beginning of a new chapter. The roles got deeper, the projects bolder. Dirty Harry redefined the cop genre, and with it, Eastwood redefined the American anti-hero. He wasn't the clean-cut savior. He was rough, morally ambiguous, and chillingly effective. Awards followed, respect followed, even fear. Studios knew Clint could carry a film with nothing more than a stare and a whisper. Directors stepped aside, producers stopped questioning. He had climbed to the very top of the industry, both as actor and director. And yet, something was always missing. He had everything, except peace. Clint worked relentlessly. He averaged a movie a year, sometimes two. Not because he loved the attention, but because he feared stillness. He once admitted, "I didn't know what to do with silence." Work kept the ghosts away. But those ghosts found him anyway. His personal life, despite the public image of rugged masculinity, was quietly falling apart. Marriages crumbled, children drifted. He had affairs, heartbreaks, and long stretches of emotional distance. Clint was present on set, but absent at home. And fame came with a cost. Privacy vanished, misinterpretations multiplied. Every word he spoke was magnified, politicized, weaponized. He learned to speak less, trust fewer, withdraw deeper. Behind the cool exterior was a man slowly unraveling in isolation. Even at the height of his power, Clint often chose to eat alone. He'd walk off red carpets the moment the cameras stopped flashing. He preferred shadows, the same shadows he had grown up hiding in. His success became a kind of armor, one that gleamed brightly but weighed heavily. And inside that armor, Clint was still fighting battles no one could see. Hollywood worshipped him. The world revered him. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still just the boy from Depression-era California, running from something that never stopped chasing him. The accolades didn't silence the doubts. The box office numbers didn't erase the loneliness. The applause didn't warm the cold nights. He had reached the summit of a mountain no one thought he could climb. But when he looked around, he realized he was standing there alone. Fame, for all its lights and glamour, is not a gift. It's a bargain. And for Clint Eastwood, that bargain came with a devastating price. As he moved into the 1,980 seconds and beyond, the Hollywood machine continued to feed on his legend. Studios called, scripts flooded in, awards stacked on shelves. But something inside Clint began to quietly fracture. He was aging, and not just physically. He felt time pressing in. Films that once flowed effortlessly began to weigh heavier. Conversations that once interested him now felt hollow. He started to realize, the louder the world got, the quieter his soul became. And then came the personal earthquakes. His long-term marriage to Maggie Johnson had ended years before, scarred by infidelity and distance. But now, even his subsequent relationships began to crumble. Lovers described him as emotionally distant, cold, unreachable. One of his ex-partners once said, "He never fully let you in because he never let himself in." In total, Clint fathered at least 8 children, some of whom he didn't publicly acknowledge for decades. The media caught wind, headlines exploded, and for the first time, the stoic image began to crack. But it was aging that cut deepest. His body, once the symbol of rugged masculinity, began to betray him. Aches turned into immobility. Sleep became elusive. Memory started playing tricks. The man who once controlled every frame of the camera could no longer control his own knees. And with age came invisibility. Hollywood, the very industry he helped shape, began to move on. Younger stars filled billboards. Executives whispered that Clint's time had passed. Streaming platforms took over theaters. Loud spectacles replaced quiet grit. His phone rang less. His name was mentioned more in retrospectives than in present tense. He tried to keep working. He directed American Sniper, The Mule, Cry Macho. Each project carried traces of the old Clint, the tight shots, the pregnant silences, the pain beneath the surface. But the buzz was fading. So was the box office. And with each passing year, a new fear crept in, not of death, but of irrelevance. He kept a low profile, retreating to his home in Carmel by the sea, surrounded by tall trees and thicker silence. Neighbors say he rarely goes out. Visitors are few. Sometimes they catch a glimpse, a frail man, walking slowly with a cane, eyes hidden behind familiar sunglasses, but the stare not nearly as sharp as it once was. He smiles less now, one acquaintance said. Not because he's unhappy, but because smiling takes energy. There were whispers about memory lapses, about a quiet sadness in his voice, about entire days spent alone, watching the ocean, saying nothing. In interviews, the rare ones he gives, he often speaks of death casually, almost like an old friend he's preparing to meet. But what he doesn't speak of is the crushing silence that fills the space where applause used to be. Once, he stood in front of millions. Now, he speaks mostly to himself. And yet, he never complains. Because Clint Eastwood has always been too proud to beg for attention, too quiet to ask for love, and too hardened to let the pain show. But those who truly look, who see beyond the icon, can't help but wonder, is this how legends fade? Not with a scandal, not with a fall, but with a whisper. There comes a point in every life, especially a life as thunderous as Clint Eastwood's, where the noise dies down, the crowds thin, the camera pans out, and a man is left to face himself. For Clint, that moment didn't arrive in a single epiphany. There was no dramatic collapse, no grand confession. Instead, it came slowly, like the sun setting behind the California hills he now calls home. After years of relentless work, Clint began to embrace stillness not as a threat, but as a companion. He no longer chased relevance. He no longer fought time. He accepted it. And in doing so, he found something he had spent his entire life avoiding: reflection. He started writing more letters to his children, reconnecting with old friends, laughing, really laughing, not just performing charm for a lens. His relationships with his children, once strained or distant, grew warmer. They weren't perfect, but they were real. One of his daughters described it best. He doesn't say sorry in words. He says it by showing up. In rare interviews, Clint has begun speaking less about movies and more about life, its brevity, its cruelty, but also its quiet beauty. He has talked about the value of forgiveness, the weight of pride, and the importance of knowing when to let go. He became more involved in nature, often sitting outside alone for hours, simply watching the sky change. He says it reminds him that not everything has to be done. Some things just have to be witnessed. Though his physical frame is frail, his presence remains towering. When Clint enters a room, even now, people fall silent. Not because he demands it, but because he has earned it. He no longer needs applause. He no longer needs headlines. What he seeks now is far more rare: peace. And in his quiet final chapters, Clint Eastwood has discovered something unexpected. Not everything is about legacy. Not everything is about conquering. Sometimes, the greatest victory is learning how to rest. Once, Clint Eastwood stood alone. In the desert, eyes narrowed, gun holstered, the wind brushing past his weathered face. That image became immortal. Now, decades later, he sits quietly on his porch, no camera in sight, watching the wind move through the trees. And somehow, that image feels even more powerful. He doesn't speak much these days. He doesn't need to. His silence says everything. The boy who grew up during the Great Depression, the man who redefined masculinity, the director who challenged the system, the father who tried and sometimes failed to love right, the icon who gave everything and asked for nothing. He is all of them, and he is still here. But for how much longer? As we reflect on the life of Clint Eastwood, we're left with one haunting question. Does greatness always come at the cost of loneliness? Or do the scars simply reveal how deeply a person has lived? If this journey has touched something in you, if it made you remember your own battles, your own silence, your own moments of standing alone in life's desert, then leave a comment below. Not for Clint, but for the part of you that sees yourself in him.